Good to have all of you here this evening. Please turn to Micah chapter 2 as we continue this evening our study in the book of Micah. We have studied to this point. We've emphasized the fact that Micah is a prophet during the period of the divided kingdom, contemporary of Isaiah, that he prophesied primarily to the southern nation, being the period of divided kingdom. There's the northern nation of Israel, the southern of Judah, and our studies of Hosea and Amos were primarily the prophecy directed to the northern tribes. But tonight, as we continue the book of Micah, it's primarily the southern tribes, although it includes the northern as well. And the theme that we have picked to remember specifically from this, one of the minor prophets, is that God is putting the people on trial. It's as though he's calling them to account for their wrongdoing, primarily their idolatry, and he's witnessing against them. And we're seeing that as we go through his testimony, the first couple of chapters describing the people's sins and the punishment that they deserve. Chapters 3 and 5, especially the leaders, the errors that he'll accuse them of, and then at the end he'll compare how they treated him to the good things he's done for them. So that's pretty much what we've been talking about to this point. So as we look at chapter 2, we've studied the first couple of verses last time. Who was God talking to in this section? How would you describe the people that he was talking to in those first couple of verses? He's talking to whom? How does he describe in the first couple of verses? Frank.
Those who devised evil against their brethren.
Okay, they devise evil, and what else does he say about them? They devise evil, and what else do we know about them? Susie.
Well, they basically think about it all the time when they're laying in bed, and then as soon as they have an opportunity in the morning, they do it. They have the power and the authority to do it.
Okay, so we've emphasized the fact that these are people who have power. They have power to do what they choose to do, and what they choose is evil. They choose to harm those who they are. They lay out, as Susie pointed out, they lay awake at night thinking of bad things to do. In the morning they do it because they have the power to do it. So they are people who have money, wealth, influence, or whatever, but they use it, it says, to take, verse 2, that which belongs to other people. People that they're able to oppress because the other people don't have the power to resist them. Those are the kinds of people that we've been talking about. And so we've emphasized in those first couple of verses that they oppress others. So we'll see now as we go along how God responds to that as we go through the chapter. Questions or comments anybody has on these first couple of verses that we've covered so far? Let's go ahead and read some more then, and we'll discuss further then. Let's read verse 3 through 11. If you'd like to read chapter 2, verse 3 through 11 for us, please. Chapter 2, verse 3 through 11. Bill, please.
Therefore, thus says the Lord, behold, against this family I am devising disaster, from which you cannot remove your necks, nor shall you walk haughtily, for this is an evil time. In that day one shall take up a proverb against you, and lament it with a bitter lamentation, saying, we are utterly destroyed. He has changed the heritage of my people, how he has removed it from me. To a turncoat he has divided our fields. Therefore you will have no one to determine boundaries by lot in the assembly of the Lord. Do not prattle, you say to those who prophesy, so they shall not prophesy to you. They shall not return insult for insult. You who are named the house of Jacob, is the Spirit of the Lord restricted? Are these his doings? Do not my words do good to him who walks upright? Lately my people have risen up as an empty. You put off the robe of the garment for those who trust you as they pass by. Like men returned from war, the woman of my people you cast out. from their pleasant houses, from their children. You have taken away my glory forever. Arise and depart, for this is not your rest. Because it is defiled, it shall destroy. Yes, the utter destruction. If a man should walk in a false spirit and speak a lie, saying, I will prophesy you to the wine and drink, even he would be the prattler of this people.
Okay, so Micah is now responding to these people who are oppressing others and describing what God's attitude and what his intentions are with regard to it. So, question number 4, verse 3. What did God say he was going to do? What was his plan with regard to these people? Verse 3. Karen.
Bring disaster against them.
All right, now notice the people had a device. They were devising things. They were devising iniquity, verse 1. So God responds, he's going to devise something. He devises disaster upon them because of the evil that they've done. How does he describe the disaster in verse 3? What are some things he says about it? Rick.
Said it's a certain thing that you'll not get out of it. It says they cannot remove their necks. So.
Okay.
Sure thing, he's going to carry it out.
Okay. So I picture like oxen with their necks in a yoke that they can't get out of. Maybe some other aspect of the illustration, but in any case, you're not going to get out of it. What I have planned for you, you can't escape. All right? Maybe some of the people that they tried to oppress may have escaped, but they're not going to escape because of the wrongs that they've done. So what else does he say? He says it's a disaster, you're not going to escape. What else? Bill.
You shall not walk haughtily.
Right, they're no longer going to be able to walk haughtily. Meaning what? If they're not going to walk haughtily, what's going to happen to them? What's the point of it?
This is an evil time.
Yeah, it's an evil time. They've been evil, so Karen, what?
They're going to be humbled.
All right, he's going to humble them. He's going to bring them down. They've got power. They think they can do what they want to do and get away with it, even if it means hurting other people. But God said, I'm going to bring you down. I'm going to humble you. It's an evil time. Not that God is evil, or even that what he's going to do is evil in the sense of wicked, but they're evil. The people are evil. God's going to humble them, and he's going to bring them down. Okay, so we'll continue reading more of what he says. Any other discussion or comments on verse 3 as he describes how he's going to deal with them? What is his devising? All right, so verse 4, he says somebody's going to take up a proverb, and basically a saying in which they are lamenting what's happening. And what is a lamentation? He says that you lament with a bitter lamentation. A lamentation is what?
See, it's a mourning or acute distress.
An expression of grief. Extreme. So we have the book of Lamentations, which is describing the grief of the people for the fall of the city. Well, here is Micah saying this is what's going to happen before it happens. And so there's going to be a lamentation in which they're going to say what? How do they describe as they grieve this lamentation? Verse 4. Terry.
We are utterly ruined, and that he has changed the portion to his people.
We are utterly destroyed, and he has changed, I think that one said the portion or the heritage of the people. And what did we talk before about an inheritance? What did we talk about that earlier in the chapter? What did he say about inheritance before?
The way I thought about this was all the promises that God had made to the nation of Israel from the very beginning. If they would do this, if they would do that, if they would follow in his way. Well, these people got used to that to the point where I think some of them just took it for granted, and they went about their way doing what they wanted to do. And now God's telling them, you're no longer going to have these promises that I gave you.
Okay. Susie?
In particular, the land.
Okay. Remember back in verse 2, last part of verse 2, they oppressed people, oppressing them with regard to their inheritance. The people had inherited the land. God had given inheritance to the different families. But these people with power, they didn't care about that. If they could take it, they would. So God said, okay, now I'm going to take away your inheritance. Okay? You devise to take other people's inheritance. I'm going to devise to take your inheritance. Okay? Other comments in verse 4. All right, so he adds, he has removed it from me to a turncoat. Now, you may have different translations of that turncoat. What's the idea of you're going to give it to a turncoat? Anybody? Did you think about that part? Susie?
Well, a turncoat is a traitor,
Okay.
and so I don't know if this is right. Israel had been trying to deal, or Judah had been trying to deal with other nations, but God is going to give this inheritance to other nations by them oppressing them. So Judah feels like, well, we've been betrayed here, but it was by their own doing.
All right, that's what I took from it as well. So that they've taken other people's inheritance, God's going to take theirs and give it to other people, to those who they would say they don't deserve this. It's our land, well, yes, but you took other people's that you didn't deserve. So you're going to lose yours to people who you think don't deserve what you had. Okay? God's not going to tolerate their sins anymore. Okay? How about verse 5? How does verse 5 relate to that? Some of this, by the way, I might add, especially the next few verses, some questions of translation make it a little bit difficult. But I think that the point is, I think we can get the point even if we can't resolve necessarily the translation questions. But verse 5, okay, he's going to give their inheritance to somebody else. And so how does he describe it? What does he say about it in verse 5? Phil?
There'll be no one to determine the boundaries of a lot.
Okay. And so if you go back to the book of Joshua, they set up, by the instruction of God, Joshua had them set boundaries for the various areas that each of the tribes would inherit. And then that land was given to the various families and so on by lot. That is, by God's guidance, but it was what we would call a matter of chance, but God was guiding it. He's deciding, okay, this territory would go to this tribe and so forth. But what he's saying is, that's not going to happen anymore. What was determined by lot for you, you're not going to have anymore because you mistreated other people. Okay? Other comments through verse 5. Susie?
I don't know. Does the King James Version use casting lots? Or does it say divide by lots or measured by lot? I guess in my mind I'm thinking to cast lots is like they did to choose an apostle after Judas died. But then by measuring lots, it's kind of like surveying, that you measure something off by lot, how we would measure out lots.
Okay. Other comments? Vilma?
The King James says, cast a cord by lot. It's a destiny and measure.
Okay. Other comments? So my understanding of it, Susie, my understanding of it was that they used a measuring line to measure it off, and then they would decide who got it by lot. Okay, so both are involved. There was a measuring line to measure who would get what, and just like we would call surveying. So they would survey the land, and then they would determine who got it. So, but the point is, he's saying is, the ultimate end of it is you're not going to get your land anymore. That's the point of it. Okay. Other comments? Anybody? Okay. So first of all, you've taken other people's property by your cruelty because you thought you had the power. Now you're going to be oppressed, even more so than the way you thought you'd oppressed other people. Other comments through verse 5. Frank.
The New King James says that there will be no one to determine the boundaries by lot.
Okay, that's not the New King James. Yeah, no one. Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
It kind of reminds me of Amos chapter 7. He had the vision of the plumb line.
Yes. Yes. Only in this case, it's a measuring line rather than an up and down line. Yeah. Okay. So now, verse 6, he begins a new section, not a related section. Something else they're going to do wrong. Not only are they oppressing the people, think in terms today of those who oppress others, mistreat other people, but now think of another wrong that they did, beginning in verse 6. And what was that? What wrong did they do beginning in verse 6? Karen.
They don't want to listen to the truths of those who prophesy to them.
Okay, they refuse to listen, don't want to listen to the prophets, and are opposing what the prophets like Micah are telling them. And they say, do not prattle, you say to those who prophesy. Don't give us any more of your prattle. We don't want to hear what you're prophesying. Now the rest of the verse is a question of a translation, so we're going to have different translations of it. Comments on the last part of the verse. Anybody want to comment on the last part of the verse? The King James says, so they shall not prophesy to you, they shall not return insult for insult. Other comments on the significance of it? Danny?
It's like if they don't say it, it's not going to happen. It's like if they don't say it, it's not going to happen.
Okay, all right. Yeah, if you can keep the prophets from prophesying, then you don't have to worry about what they say. And that's really what it comes down to, isn't it? And then, the last part of the verse, the main point of it goes into verse 7. The point is, you don't want to hear it because it's unfavorable to you, but ultimately what it really is good for you. You need to hear it. Now, regardless of how the translation comes out, that's the point that he's making. This is what's good for you. The prophets are telling you what you need to hear, but you think you don't want to hear it. And as Danny said, if you don't hear it, then you don't have to worry about it. God can't do anything to you if you don't know about it. But it's ignorance is bliss type of thing. But the point is, God is really trying to help you by telling you these things. Other comments or thoughts on verse 6 and 7 and the problem of not wanting to listen to the prophets? What does that remind you of today? What thoughts do you have as you think about the prophets like this, Rick?
Well, you go back to 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, and you got people that just want to hear what they want to hear, and they don't care if you're talking to them straight out of the Bible, telling them what God says. They're not going to take it unless they want to hear it. They'll listen to somebody else who will tell them that.
Okay, Carrie.
Well, and it's still true today. There are many, many situations today where we all know what the truth is. But leaders and so-called authorities and all will absolutely say the opposite, as if that's the truth.
And so we discussed that as we closed the book of 2 Timothy, didn't we? That the scriptures are inspired of God to provide us to good works, instruct us in righteousness and so on, but there are people who don't want to hear it. Because it doesn't say what they want it to say. It restricts them in ways that they don't want to be restricted. And so here's an example of it. And we see it all around us today as well. Okay? So I ask you then question number 12, other passages. Can you list other passages in which the prophets the people tried to hinder the prophets from giving their message? They didn't want to listen to the message of the prophets. But you have other passages on that? Terry.
Jeremiah 38:4. Then the official said to the king, let this man be put to death, for he is weakening the hands of the soldiers who are left in this city, and the hands of all the people by speaking such words to them. For this man is not seeking the welfare of this people, but their harm. It was King Zedekiah and Jeremiah at the time of Jeremiah.
And that happens again and again in the book of Jeremiah, where the people said, we don't want to hear what you have to say. They even threw him in prison, threatened to kill him because they didn't like what he was saying. Okay? Other passages about people trying to silence preachers. Steve.
In Isaiah 30, verse 10, who say to the seers, do not see, and to the prophets, do not prophesy to us right things. Say to us smooth things, prophecy deceits.
Okay, so we've considered that one too, haven't we? The people want smooth things. Say what sounds good to us. Don't tell us necessarily, we don't necessarily want what's right, we want what sounds good to us. Now, of course, most people won't come right out and say that, but that's what they mean. Tell us what we want to hear. We're not so much concerned about whether it's right, but we want it to be agreeable to us. And that's what these people are doing here too. They say, do not prattle, but God is saying that His Spirit is given a message for our good. And we need to realize that, whether it's what we like it or not. Okay, other comments on other scriptures or other comments on the message to the prophets? Karen?
Acts 4:18, talking about the apostles, said, so they called them and commanded them not to speak at all, nor teach in the name of Jesus, trying to silence them.
Okay. All right. Other comments? Susie?
You can summarize it, but my favorite one is of the prophet, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, Micah, in 2 Chronicles 18. It's just so obvious that King Ahab of Israel will not listen to a righteous prophet. The prophet's even told, say something good, and so he does, and he knows he's lying then. It's just, I like that because it's so obvious.
Yeah, here's King Ahab, the husband of Jezebel. He says, I hate this prophet because he always says bad things to me. Well, maybe that should tell you something, you know. Maybe it's you should look at instead of criticizing the prophet. And so it is today. So many people don't want to hear the message of the gospel. They don't want to hear what it says about moral issues because they don't want to correct their lives in many cases. They don't want to hear what it says about spiritual issues because it's telling them that they're not worshiping properly or they haven't been baptized properly, the church isn't proper, or what have you, denominationalism, on and on it goes. People will listen as long as you're saying what they want you to hear. And those of us who have websites and spend much time on the social media can see that. It doesn't take long until you put up something, people like, oh, amen, amen, amen. You say something like, oh, you don't hear from them then. Or if you do hear, it's bad. It's really disagreement. People want to hear what pleases them. And that's what Micah's dealing with here. Other comments through verse 7. All right, so he continues then describing, I think, back to the oppression of other people. And again, some of this, there's some questions of translation, but the point is, I think, is clear, even though we have some difficulties in the specifics of the translation. What do they do in their mistreatment of others in verse 8? What does he say there? Terry?
Well, they take the possessions of the unsuspecting who do not look for them to treat them that way, and they take their possessions.
Okay, that's the point of it, isn't it? They take the possessions of people who are unsuspecting. They take pull the robe off the garment from those who trust you as they pass by, not expecting to be attacked. The men return to war. That's a questionable part of the last part of the verse, but I think the point is this is not a war. You're not expecting these people to attack you like you would if you were at war, but they're completely unexpecting it. They're completely innocent. They haven't done anything wrong to you, and yet you attack them and take their property. And back then to the first part of the chapter and the mistreatment of those who were helpless, unable to defend themselves. Okay? Other comments on verses 8. Susan?
Well, it says they're acting as enemies toward their own people.
And it's not, it's not like they're an enemy of some other nation or something. It's their own people, completely innocent. Okay? Other comments? And again, don't we have that today? People can mistreat you. Why is it that you have to continually be on guard for people to call you on the telephone or send you emails suspicious that they're trying to cheat you? And yet, isn't that the way it's become in our society? You never know who you can trust in so many cases. And that's what he's talking about. Okay? Other comments? Okay? What else? Verse 9, related to it. What else do they do? Similar to taking from those innocent people who passed by, what else do they do in verse 9?
They cast women out of their homes and cause children to become unfaithful by their actions. They're ridiculing the prophets and putting down their faith.
Okay? So you're casting out the women from their pleasant houses, from their children. So, again, the people that you would most think ought to be protected. The people that are innocent, children. You would think people wouldn't harm children. Women, we tend to understand, should be protected. And that's not a sexist thing to say. That's a responsibility of men, is to take care of women, not to harm them. And yet, they didn't care. If they could get something from these people, they would take it. And so he's taken away God's glory. Comments on he says, you've taken away my glory. Comments on that? Anybody? Terry.
In the English Standard, it's connected with the idea of the children. From their young children you take away my splendor forever. Like Frank was referring to, that their actions destroy a child's knowledge of who God is, and they take away God's splendor from that child.
Okay. Child's been hurt, hard for them to believe in God after people have mistreated them. You hear about that kind of thing. Something like that, I think, is the idea here. That the end result of mistreatment, the end result of evil is people blame God, as though there must not be a God. Why do we have all these problems if there's a God in heaven? Okay? Other comments? Through verse 9. All right, so again, verse 10 now, he begins to discuss what's going to happen as a result. The consequence of this, beginning in verse 10, is what? What's going to happen? You mistreated all these people. There's going to be consequences. What does he say beginning in verse 10? It's on question number 16. Steve.
Depart from the land.
All right, going to have to depart from the land. Arise and depart, for this is not your rest. It is defiled. It shall destroy, yes, with utter destruction. What does he mean by that? Again, we may not know the specifics of each phrase, but the point, obviously, as Steve said, is they're going to be taken into captivity. Going to leave the land. What is the part about this is not your rest? Meaning what? Did you think about that? What do you mean when you said this is not your rest?
Well, if he's talking to the evil people, it's the people that took it by force and not by their inheritance.
Okay, yes. God often spoke of the inheritance as the place of rest. Whereas instead of Egypt, where they were slaves or wandering in the wilderness and so on, this is going to be your place of rest. But he's saying this is not your rest. It was your place of rest, but it was your inheritance. But I'm going to take away your inheritance. It's not going to be your place of rest anymore, because it's defiled. Who defiled it? They did. You've defiled the land, and so utter destruction is going to be the result. You're going to have to leave. This is not your place of rest. This is no longer going to be your inheritance. You've defiled it, and so there's going to be destruction. Okay, that's what I took through verse 10. Questions, comments, then?
they had defiled the land because of their actions, the evil things they had done against their fellow man, their brethren, and because of their idolatry.
Yes, now we haven't got into the idolatry as much yet so far, but we will. And yes, again, as we've seen, you begin to see a pattern, I think, in these minor prophets. Same problems discussed again and again because they're talking to the people who are doing these kinds of things. And it's just like with us today, when in our preaching and our teaching we talk about some of the similar kinds of things. We talk about homosexuality, we talk about divorce, we talk about transgenderism. Why do we keep talking about the same things? Because that's what the problems are that our society is dealing with. That's what people need to hear about. Okay, and that's why these prophets again and again deal with these problems and what's going to happen as a result, because they're trying to warn the people to correct their lives. We have the same responsibility today to warn people today. The consequence, the way you're acting is going to lead to a fall. It is not going to be acceptable to God. He will not allow this to continue sooner or later, and even more important, He'll give an answer after this life. Welcome, Susie.
In Leviticus 18, God was, through Moses, was telling the people that the reason they were going to be able to possess the promised land was because the heathen nations had defiled the land and the land had vomited them out. Now he's saying, and if you don't obey me, when you go into the land will vomit you out too. So this is a fulfillment of what he was saying would happen.
Exactly.
It's not specific, but in general.
Which we've already studied before, haven't we? Again and again. I've warned you again and again. He's telling you, don't be like the nations around you. Don't be like the nations that were in the land, and I brought you in to cast them out. You didn't get this land because you were so good. Remember that? You got it because the people were so evil, and I wanted them cast out, and as a fulfillment of the promise to Abraham, but not because you were so good. But I've told you again and again, if you act like the people who were in the land, you're not going to stay in the land either. And if we act like those people in our society today, God's not going to bless us either. I don't know what God's time scale is, but I don't see any reason to think it's any different today. If people continue in evils, God's not going to continue to bless this country. Okay, other comments through verse 10. And then verse 11. Now I believe he's back again talking about what they said about the prophets. They didn't want the prophets to prophesy to them, the true prophets. But verse 11 then, what kind of question number 17? What did they want? Steve?
They wanted prophecies denouncing God's word.
All right, prophecy that would disagree with God, but agree with what they wanted. See, back to that point, a false spirit speaking a lie. Remember 2 Timothy chapter 4, people who will tell you myths, say what you want to hear, and so on. And how does he illustrate it in the last part of verse 11? Right.
That saying the lie that they're prophesying is, I will prophesy to you wine and drink, or in other words, that prosperity and peace and happiness. There's not going to be anything bad happen to us. There's no danger of these outside forces, but they'll have peace and prosperity.
And not only peace and prosperity, but do what you want. Drinking's fine, no problem. Live it up. Do what you want. And you don't have to worry about the consequences. Exactly. And that's, again and again, what the prophets are saying. Jeremiah deals with that. Isaiah, the people say, peace, peace. But there isn't peace. They only think that there's peace because God's not punishing them yet. He's warning them and giving them an opportunity to repent. But they'll soon find out that there isn't any peace if they don't serve God. Okay?
This is not exactly the same thing, but I found it interesting back in Amos chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. And I raised up your sons for prophets, and your young men for Nazarites. And then verse 12. But ye gave the Nazarites wine to drink, and commanded the prophets, saying, Prophesy not.
Yeah, so we studied that in Amos, didn't we? And again, Amos, one of the main points of Amos was, don't be like the nations round about. Remember, he talked about the various nations, and he said, if you're like them, you're going to be sent into captivity, same as them. Okay, other comments through verse 11 then. All right, now, interestingly enough, one of the characteristics of the prophets, which is hard to get used to, at least it's hard for me to get used to, is they can just turn on a dime and start talking of blessings instead of the cursings they've been talking about, the blessings that will come if the people will change. And that's what happens, I believe, in the beginning of verse 12. So let's read 12 and 13. Who'd like to read chapter 2, verse 12 and 13? Neil, please.
I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together like sheep of the fold, like a flock in the midst of their pasture. They shall make a loud noise because of so many people. The one who breaks open will come up before them. They will break out, pass through the gate, and go out by it. Their king will pass before them with the Lord at their head.
All right, so what group of people is he talking about now? Question number 19. He mentions a particular group of people, which he calls, how does he refer to it?
Remnant of Israel.
The remnant. Now, we talked about that expression before, and we'll talk about it a lot of times before we're through with the prophets. The remnant was what? What's a remnant? A remnant is? Susie.
Those who would persevere and remain faithful to God.
Okay, a small part of a whole. It's not the main part of it. It's a small part of it. Those who are faithful to God in any society are always the few. Matthew 7, 13, and 14. The prophets often refer to them as the remnant. So God's going to say, I will assemble and gather the remnant, the whole remnant. Okay, now the remnant is used a couple of different ways specifically in prophecy. One is the people who would come back from Babylonian captivity, but it also at times is used beyond that to look to those who are faithful to God under the New Testament. The faithful out of the New Testament who would be obedient to the gospel are also the remnant. So how does he describe this remnant in the last part of verse 12? What's going to be done to them? What's going to happen to the remnant? Verse 12. Gather together. Okay? He's going to gather them together like sheep in a flock or a fold in the midst of a pasture. Well, here's another illustration that we've seen in other ways. Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. John chapter 10, Jesus described, I am the good shepherd, and my sheep know my voice, and so on. So this refers to the remnant. They're like the shepherd, the flock. How does he describe the number of them in the last part of verse 12? How many are there? How does he describe it? Okay.
It says there are so many, they'll make a loud noise.
Okay. So a remnant is going to be brought. So many, even though it's a relatively small few, it's going to be so many of them that they make a loud noise. So in other words, it's not just a tiny few, but it's still just part of the overall group. Okay? Many of them, and yet they're still just a part of the group because most of the people went into error. Okay? And so what happens to them in verse 13 then? What does God do for them? Verse 13. Question number 21.
Helps them with all their difficulties. He helps them with all their difficulties.
All right, helps their difficulties. Okay. Susan?
He leads them as their king and Lord.
All right, the king and Lord, he leads them, and they break out through the gate. What does that remind you of? What does that picture? When else had the people escaped, broken out from bad circumstance? Susie?
Sin.
sin. Okay, that's the application to us, isn't it? In the Old Testament, they'd broken out from slavery in Egypt. They're going to break out again from Babylonian captivity. But those today who are God's people are those who have followed the leadership of our King to escape from the consequences of sin. So here are all these people who are disobeying God. They've devised evil. God devises evil against them. They're going to suffer, but there will be those who will do right. They will escape the consequences of the sin, and God will pass before them as their head, which I believe, again, is the New Testament. We've seen it again and again. We'll see it some more. But now there's the blessing of the gospel. So despite the fact that God is warning them of their suffering and their hardship because of their sins, He always wants them to remember they can do right and ultimately be blessed. Other comments with chapter number 2? Anybody? All right, take up on chapter number 3 next time, and I will